Okay, John, second New Deal takes hold. This is chapter 23.2. Or understand the second phase of the New Deal, right? Roosevelt's going to kind of feel that the original deal has stalled, isn't really working, and he's going to have to kind of pump some more money and progress into the economy. All right? So the big question here is, was this successful? Was all this government action in the economy going to be successful? That's a big question here.
And one thing we want to keep in mind is we know FDR won in a landslide in the election of 1932 over Herbert Hoover. Right? Following his election, he implemented the 100 days, the fireside chat, the bank holiday, and all the other things we spoke about in 23.1. Well, about 2 years into the presidency, his first New Deal had sort of plateaued. He created jobs, but not enough jobs. Unemployment was still high. The average household income was still very low. And so he didn't prime the pump, so to speak, for the economy as much as he would like. But in the midterm elections of 1934, the American people overwhelmingly voted Democrat, with huge numbers of Democrats replacing Republicans in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. This gave FDR the confidence that he should move forward, continuing his programs, continuing his plans, because obviously the American people approve of it. And that leads us to the second New Deal. But before that, we want to point out that one of the motivations for the second New Deal was the idea of the forgotten man. Now, FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was one of the most influential first ladies in American history. She created the modern first lady position, where the wife of the president has a huge amount of social influence and can actually influence legislation by influencing her husband's platform and program initiatives. And that's what she did. And she made sure that FDR always remembered the poorest and the most downtrodden in society, the men and women who still have not found work and who need help more than anything else. She also prodded FDR to make sure he hired some women for his cabinet too, so he could start to break down barriers in that regard also.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most important members of FDR's cabinet was Francis Perkins, who was the labor secretary during the New Deal. Being in charge of all the government regulations on business during the New Deal was a very big deal, and that was a woman under FDR. Going to the 1936 election, he's going to run again for his second term. He's going to very, very easily defeat the Republican challenger, Alf Landon. He's governor of Kansas, and he basically is running as like a New Deal light. He's not even really running against the New Deal, and doesn't really gain much popularity or support, and FDR easily wins. And it's going to set him up for the second New Deal. He's going to have the mandate, he's going to have the popular support, right? He's going to win broad swaths of the American electorate. We call it the New Deal coalition, and it's going to keep Democrats in power really until the 50s and 60s. The first time African Americans are voting Democrat, the majority of African Americans are voting Democrat for the first time in 1936 and not voting Republican.
Yeah, not only that, but basically all the unions are now behind Democrats too. It used to be pretty split between Democrats and Republicans. Now all the unions are behind Democrats too. And this is still true today.
Yeah, you can see this still playing out. These are two major bases of the modern Democratic Party: unions and African Americans. Right. The original AAA, right, which was found unconstitutional, but a lot of that helped farmers who actually owned their farms. The second New Deal is going to be more focused on helping farmers that don't own their farms, that are migrants, that are sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Right? These people were still suffering, these people were still poor. This gave aid to them, allowed them maybe to purchase their own farms, kind of more support for their economic situation, which hadn't really come through in the first New Deal. The big major sorry, Mr. Coleman, I cut you off.
Yeah, I was about to
take it away.
Okay, so the WPA, thank you very much, I appreciate that. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, not only did FDR want to pump money into the farmers, but basically in the second New Deal, they needed to create jobs immediately, right away. So they pumped $5 billion back into society to create jobs, and they're literally just creating jobs to give people jobs. These guys are building anything and everything, from public buildings to roads, and a lot of times these are short-term jobs. They're not really long-term jobs, but FDR wants to pump as much money back into society as he possibly could. Of course, this is a huge extension of the federal government here, creating programs that are created very transparently just to make jobs. And that's it, just to get people back to work. And not only did they create the WPA, but they also created the National Youth Administration, which gave like part-time clerical jobs to high school and college students, gave scholarships to these students, helping them achieve higher education, basically recognizing these people who need jobs who aren't quite of age yet to enter the workforce. We need to help support them and almost delay their entrance into the workforce as long as we can, so we can try and get the economy back on its feet before they get to that point.
And the WPA was, it was blue collar and white collar labor, right? They hired authors that were out of work and writers out of work to write. They wrote these really great travel guides for every state. One of the best things that came out of WPA was they actually hired journalists to go out and interview everyone that had been a slave. So there's this great primary source material of interviews of people talking about their experience as slaves. And at this time, they're all 80, 90 years old. But we have a lot of really great information about life in the 1840s and 50s and 60s because of this WPA program that allowed authors and journalists to go out and interview slaves.
And continuing the Second New Deal, so not only do we have the WPA and NYA established, but they revisit the now defunct NIRA, which, if you remember, created the NRA. In case there aren't enough acronyms for you, we now have the Wagner Act. See, so that's much easier to remember. The Wagner Act is basically the new NRA, because the other one was ruled unconstitutional by those old white conservative Supreme Court members that FDR did not like very much. This one pretty much did the same thing as the other one, except they jumped through all the loopholes they needed to in order to make it effective. It listed all the business practices that were unfair that businesses could not do. It also gave workers the right to unionize and the right to collectively bargain for fair wages. So this really helped out the average worker.
Yeah, totally unfettered unionization too, right? An employer couldn't ban unions, couldn't ban organizing, couldn't not hire someone because they were part of the union, right? It really gave unions a lot of power. One of the more lasting impacts of the New Deal is the Social Security Act, right? And this gives a lot of things. First of all, and kind of the way most people remember and see it, is old age insurance, right? So you, every day, I'm sure some of you who started working, if you look at your pay stub, you get a little bit of money taken out every time that goes into Social Security. But that money is going into a fund, theoretically, that will eventually, when you retire, will pay you out a cash payment.
Theoretically.
Theoretically. This then existed, so if you stopped working, you just stopped having income before the Social Security Act. Right, so a lot of the poorest people in the country were actually just old people who had retired, and their savings had been wiped out, especially by the financial crisis, by the crash in the stock market. So these are people that were really suffering, that were really hurting economically, and this is going to give them a cash payment to help them kind of stay afloat and survive.
This has been, real quick, this has been by far, and this is important to recognize, by far the biggest impact of the New Deal is the Social Security Act. We still have it today, 80 years later. It's incredibly important, and it doesn't only give aid to old age, which is what most people recognize it for today, but it also gives unemployment benefits to people in between jobs to help them stay afloat, so they can still pay their car payments and mortgage and go grocery shopping while they're looking for another job, so they don't default on all their loans. And it gives aid to families with dependents, you know, a single mother with a bunch of children, maybe who's widowed, and the disabled who can't take care of themselves, can't work a job to make enough money to take care of themselves. The government helps them out and gives them money each month so they can make ends meet.
Right. The last thing that we really see in the Second New Deal is electrification. You guys probably look at this, you don't think it's that big of a deal, but in 1936, only about 30% of rural Americans had electricity in their homes. Right? And the goal here is the Rural Electrification Administration is to kind of spread electricity and get all of these rural communities into the grid and using electricity, which again makes a much better life for you. I'm sure all of how many of your products are electronic, right? And by 1950, almost 90% of Americans had electricity, which is a huge success for the rural electrification.
Yeah, and this is sort of piggybacking on, in 23-1, there's something called the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Administration, in which they went out into Tennessee and they provided electricity and damming the rivers and everything for the poor in Tennessee. And this is sort of building on that idea of spreading something that's essential to society at the time into rural areas that didn't have it before.
All right, Don, thanks for watching. Any other questions, make sure to ask your history teacher.